Hello, everyone. I'm Kristen Hipwell. I'm the Director of Product Marketing with Perfection Learning, and I am excited to have each of you joining us for tonight's AP Lang webinar, Sentence Matters, the Rhetoric of Syntax. Before we get started, 2 quick items. 1, if you have questions during the webinar, please be sure to post them in the chat section at the bottom of your screen. Dr. Brandon Abdon will be addressing those questions throughout the session as it is appropriate and at the end of the webinar as well. And then 2, Perfection Learning will be sending out an email tomorrow with both the webinar recording and the slide deck that's being used. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our expert teacher for the evening. Dr. Brandon Abdon comes to us with over 20 years of experience in the classroom, including 12 years as a high school English teacher, many years as a professor of English and education, and time as a curriculum developer and instructional coach. In addition to the time that he spent in the classroom, Brandon has more than 10 years of experience as a consultant and formerly worked as the lead director for the International Advanced Placement Program at the College Board. Our favorite credential on Brandon's resume is as senior author of Perfection Learning's AP Literature and AP Language course books by AMSCO. Brandon, thank you so much for being here to share your knowledge, and I'm going to pass the presentation off to you.
Great. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate, once again, I'm seeing some names that are that we often see on these webinars. And I'm seeing some new people. So I love that. And especially for everyone to show up for such a sexy presentation as one on sentences and syntax. But hopefully we're able to have a little bit of fun and play with some things. Because life happens, I'm going to also say that we're getting a pretty wicked storm outside right now. And so if something does happen and you lose me, then the power has gone out here. But for right now, we are still on air, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. If you give me just a moment. While I'm finding that to share my screen, if you would go ahead and familiarize yourself with the chat button. We will be using that chat button throughout to interact in this, and I really like to get people involved with these sorts of things. And so there will be opportunities for you all to contribute in both the chat as well as to come off of the chat and talk and share too. So give me just a moment. Let me share my screen. And there we go. All right. So the first thing I'd like you to do is, once you found that chat, go ahead and drop in your name, your location, and I would really like to know the song that's stuck in your head right now. The song that is stuck in my head right now is Baby Love. Baby Love, my baby. I don't know why it's stuck in my head. I guess I heard it here recently in the past couple of days, but it's been stuck in my head incessantly. I even listened to it on the way home from picking my son up today, hoping to get it out of my head, and it still didn't work. So go ahead, find that chat and drop in your name, your location, and the song that is stuck in your head. See who all's here. And Kristen, I want to make sure everybody has access to the chat. Yes? All right. Well, maybe people don't have access to the chat. I see some things popping up in the Q&A. Oh, the chat's been disabled. Oh, no. It should work now. I think somebody just turned it on. There we go. Yes, it's working. It's fantastic, and I'm excited for that. Good, because I really like to hear from everyone. So go ahead, drop your name, your location, and that song that's stuck in your head. Just see who's here. Thank you, Amy, for letting me know. And those of you who found the Q&A, we always work this stuff out and figure it out. So great. So I've seen some people from Arkansas. I'm going to be in Arkansas on Monday and Tuesday. Looking really forward to that. Let's see. We've got people coming into us from Florida. Caitlin there in Connecticut. Thank you. Take on me. Yeah, maybe Caitlin. That's a catchy one. It gets stuck in my head pretty often too. Peter, thanks for being here. Julie Chesney, Rotterdam, New York. Got it. Whatever it is by ZBB. I don't know. That drive you crazy when you can't remember the name of the song, but it's stuck in your head. Thanks, Sean, for being here from Roswell. I know Roswell. I've been there a few times. You still live down that way. Amanda here from Kansas by the sea. Yep, that's a good one too. At least these are some good songs that get stuck in your head a little bit. So, all right, everybody. Thanks for participating. It's great to see some people dropping in from different places. Fantastic. All right. So we're going to go ahead and move on here. And here's our agenda. And just kind of some things that I want us to think about with sentences. There's no way in an hour, essentially a 45-minute presentation, and you hear my little dog over here kind of whining because of the storm. Sorry about that. But there's no way in an hour presentation that I could do everything there is to do with sentences and teaching sentences and things like that. This is just really kind of distilling some of the things that I've learned in my experiences working with students, but also in working with teachers and the things that their students react the most to. And the things that students seem to learn the most from. And so we're going to talk about a couple of things here with these concepts and get a little bit of chance to practice. But I really like us to think, maybe start by thinking about this picture that I have here of Pinocchio, whose nose has exploded. And you may be familiar with this kind of paradox. The idea that Pinocchio says my nose will grow now, and then there's all these problems with that. But then all this idea with this sentence is a lie, and we think of the complete thought that comes with that. But this statement and the distance between semantics and the actual idea, the actual concepts in our mind, and that language is imperfect. So we touch on that just a little bit as we go through today. But the first thing I'd like you to do, you found the chat. We know it's working now, and that's great. I'd like you to take just a few minutes and do some writing. So go ahead and open the chat. And I'd like you to respond to this question that's going to come up over here in the gray. Respond there. Take your time and think and write. It's just rough draft thinking, so no pressure. I've got a 3-minute timer down here. We might take a full 3 minutes. We may not. Do not hit enter until I tell you to. We're going to do a chat blast. So go ahead and do your writing. And here's what I'd like you to think about. I want you to think about both reading and writing. And in the chat, don't hit enter yet, but in the chat, why do sentences matter? That's it. 3 minutes. Go ahead and take some time, type that in. Why do sentences matter in both reading and writing? Don't hit enter yet. Be sure to explain some of your thinking. Oh, Amy, don't worry about it. No worries. You've got about a minute and a half left. You might be finished. That's fine. You may still be doing some writing or thinking back about what you've written. That's fine too. All right, you have about 30 seconds remaining. Go ahead and get any ideas down. If you were writing in your writer's notebook, like my students or my college students, I would tell you to get some bullets down, make sure that you capture some ideas if you're not going to be able to complete them. I could really forward to seeing what you all have activated here with your thinking and your writing. So let's go ahead, and when you're ready, you can hit enter, and let's do that chat blast. And after a moment, go back and look at what everyone's written. Look at what your colleagues are bringing to the table. The first one I see is Laura dropping a great metaphor on us here. They are the clay with which we shape meaning, communicate emotions, and reflect opinions. Wow. Laura, thank you for that. The idea of clay that we shape. And she extends that metaphor. I love it. A lot of thought going into that, Laura. Thank you. Janet's dropping in another metaphor with sentences create rhythm and help prose to flow like a song. And I'm glad you said that, because one of the books that I recommend to people, and if you guys want to write this down, that's great. It is The Art of Syntax. All right, by Ellen Voigt. And the subtitle is Rhythm of Thought, Rhythm of Song. It's a beautiful book, just a tiny little book. And I love these Art of series. So you can check those out. It's published by Gray Wolf. So check that out. So thanks, Janet. Gene, I mean, I would have expected a room full of English teachers to drop in a whole bunch of metaphors. I like to think of sentences as a car driving the reader along the road of comprehension. Thank you. And thanks for connecting to the reader. Gene, I really appreciate that. It's really what we're going to do when we think about rhetoric. Beth, conveying direction, emotion, etc. Thank you for that. A good sentence clarifies thinking. I love it. We're going to be looking at that too. Capturing voice, Amanda says. Thank you so much, Amanda, for that. Your audience depends on you being able to convey meaning. Hillary, thank you. And I see Hillary talking about rhetorical situation. I think Hillary might have looked forward in our book here a little bit to see where we're going and what we're going to be doing. And I don't have time to read all of these, but I really appreciate what you've dropped in, and I hope you've seen some stuff from your colleagues here. But a lot of what I'm seeing is talking about in relation to the reader, relation to the audience, and that is fantastic. The thing is, as many of you probably know, your students don't think of them like that. Your students aren't there. And we're going to talk a little bit about that too, and why students need to begin thinking about sentences as thought. So we think, what is a sentence? Well, in elementary school, I learned, and I still hear it often in elementary schools that I visit. I see it in elementary textbooks I spend time with, where they tell students that a sentence is a complete thought. And I love that concept, because that's something that a kid, even if they can't read or write yet, they can think. And so we think about students seeing a sentence and hearing a sentence and knowing that a sentence is a complete thought, an idea, no, not an idea, I'm going to back up, a thought that the brain sees as finished. And we'll see some stuff that's not like that here in a moment. But then something happens. Often it's middle school, sometimes late elementary school, where we get really into grammar instruction. And grammar is necessary in its way. But then you start asking students, late middle school, early high school, on through high school, what is a sentence? And the first thing they say, and a lot of my future English teachers that I work with say the same thing. They'll say, oh, it's a subject and a verb, and maybe a direct object if you have a transitive verb. And that might be true, but it can't be grammar alone, because I could take a noun and a verb and maybe a direct object that have nothing to do with one another and put them together into what I would call a sentence based upon that, but the idea doesn't work. So it has to come back to something that makes sense here. It's a complete thought. Before anything, it's a complete thought. And we use the grammar to explain and define the parts. The analogy I like for this is a car. I want a car to run and to get me places. Yes, I've got to label the parts. I know that there are tires. I know that there's a motor. I know there's parts of the motor, everything, but I don't care about all the parts, and I don't have to know all the parts to be able to use it. And that's the same thing with this sentence stuff. Kids don't have to know all of those parts. You may have learned how to diagram sentences when you were coming up. I learned to diagram sentences as I was coming up. And there was some value to that only in reflection, but there was all of that instruction that I got was purely about being able to do it. It wasn't about understanding how those different parts of sentences related to ideas and thought. This really relates to the way we think. And so I've got here cognitive science, but then epistemology, which is really the philosophy of knowing. And our brains want to experience resolution of thought. They want to see things completed. And it causes us to engage with the text and to stick around for it. And so it's not just, and you've probably heard this, where the kids say, well, how many sentences are in a paragraph? How many words are a sentence? I say a sentence is a complete thought. I told my own 10-year-old that several weeks ago when he was working on something. I said, well, the teachers asked you to use complete sentences, so you need to write that in a complete sentence. And the question the teacher had asked was, why does this, and this happen? And my son had written, because X. So, well, that's not really a complete sentence. You have to have a complete sentence, it has to be a complete thought. And he wrote, it just is, period. Well, that's a complete thought. So then we had to have a conversation about it and what it was and how he needed to restate it. And all the normal frustrations that come out for kids with those sorts of things as they're learning to do school. And then we want to think about rhetoric and how it's not just that I'm completing a thought. I'm making choices when I write a sentence, or I'm experiencing the choices another writer made when he or she wrote that sentence. And those choices are affecting me in some way, or the choices I'm making are hopefully affecting my audience in some way. And so all of these things matter. But it really does come back to the fact that in elementary school, we learn it's a complete thought. And that's what we need to focus on. So here's a sentence for you. Imani brought. Well, that's not a sentence. I put a period at the end of it, but it's not. You might know that brought is a transitive verb. Like she has to have brought something. What is it? Imani brought what? My brain can't handle that. Imani brought what? After you finish your green beans, after I finish my green beans, what? As I mentioned earlier, that an elementary student who can't yet read or write, you tell them this, and they know that that thought is incomplete. They're like, what? After I finish my green beans, what? I get ice cream? After I finish my green beans, I go to bed? I need you to finish that. My brain is tweaked. You've got my attention. What's going to happen? If they haven't done their homework, what? Now we know this. You may know this as a conditional. There's a condition here. If they haven't done my homework, what? What's going to happen? Okay, those guys played. They played what? Now, I guess this could be a comment on, guys, playing the game, like they're players. It could be, but without context, I don't know. And so it's just a fragment. It's not a complete thought. Then you cannot understand. I cannot understand based on what? So I think you see here that we all know and agree, and our students would know and agree, that these are not complete sentences. And the reason it matters is we want students to think, oh, well, a sentence is a complete thought. Just because I put a period on it doesn't mean it's the end. Our brains seek resolution. We saw this even before we could read, like I talked about earlier. But if you've taught creative writing, you may have already hit on something that I'm going to comment on here. We see sentences like this all the time in dialogue. And so these sorts of things can keep our attention. If in the context, someone says, they're not going to the game tonight. Oh, well, why aren't they going to the game tonight? Someone asks. Oh, if they haven't done their homework. So yeah, the complete thought is split up by the dialogue. And that's one of the reasons why dialogue, if it's written well, can really help to keep our attention. So these things do matter in that way. But when we're thinking about rhetoric, argument, reading other people's arguments, we need those ideas complete. So you're probably thinking, okay, Brandon, we get it. Sentences are complete thoughts. You didn't have to spend all that time on that. You could have just told us that and moved on. Well, you're right. Students need to get that. And then you can start playing with it. And that's what we're going to do now. So we're going to look at basics and modifiers. And you notice I say basics, and that'll matter here in just a moment. So here's a sentence, two sentences actually, three sentences. We're going to look at two of them, but they're three to create context. From a speech by Sonia Sotomayor that was on the exam last year. Just coincidentally, it is also a multiple choice passage, really coincidentally. It's a multiple choice passage in the AMSCO AP language textbook that I worked on. And it's just a great speech. I'm going to read this aloud and then we're going to play with it a little bit. Being a Latina in America also does not mean speaking Spanish. I happen to speak it fairly well. But my brother, only 3 years younger, like too many of us educated here, barely speaks it. You see at the bottom I've got here, let's find the base sentence. So grammatically, we're looking for the noun, we're looking for the verb, and we might be looking for another noun, a direct object. Okay. Sorry if I'm cutting out. There is, like I said, there is a storm here. I did see the chat just come through, and I apologize for that. So here's a base sentence. I happen to speak it fairly well. We see I speak it. That's the base sentence for this. So she says, I speak it. And we know that from the previous sentence, she's talking about Spanish. Next, but my brother, only 3 years younger, like too many of us educated here, barely speaks it. Well, here's a base sentence. My brother speaks it. Some of you are already seeing the problem. And this is what we want students to do. But my brother, only 3 years younger, barely speaks it. So this is the sentence I end up with. My brother barely speaks it. And I've got this modifier. So what I'm going to say might drive some of you, especially if you're a grammarian, crazy. But there's base sentences, noun, verb, direct object, whatever. And then there's modifiers. That's it. I'm not caring very much if they're adjectives or adverbs or prepositions or prepositional phrases or whatever. All of those things are modifiers for the base sentence. And the modifiers depend on the rhetorical situation. So let's see this play out a little bit. Being a Latina in America also does not mean speaking Spanish. I speak it, my brother speaks it. If I take that contextualizing sentence and put it with the two basic sentences, this is what I get. We also know her brother barely speaks it. So we see how this, which we know is an adverb, doesn't matter if that's an adverb. I don't care if a kid calls it an adverb or not, as long as the student knows that it's modifying how the brother speaks it, that he barely speaks it. Well, not only does she speak it, she speaks it well. So now I have this contrast between her speaking it well and her brother barely speaking it. She doesn't just speak it well, she speaks it fairly well. All right. So we have still this contrast between barely and well, or fairly well. But, and this but is only enhancing this contrast between her speaking it fairly well and her brother barely speaking it. So talking to students about, okay, why does she drop this but? She doesn't have to have this but here. Why the big but? Why does she emphasize this shift? And it's just by looking at a modifier like this. Now, why does it matter that he's 3 years younger than her? Why does she tell us that? What's the point in telling us that? How does that relate to other things that she's saying in the passage? And so we're just looking at these 2 or 3 sentences and we're asking these types of questions. Then she says, my brother only 3 years younger, barely speaks it. Well, now I see only, like he's not that far from her. She's wanting to emphasize that. So modifiers always are emphasizing something or bringing in some sort of information that relates directly to the rhetorical situation. And then we'll see in students' own writing, if it's not relating to the situation, they may not need it. Now, this is a big deal. Like too many of us, take just a moment and tell me in the chat why you think she drops this modifying phrase, like too many of us, into this sentence. Drop your thinking in the chat. Again, the question is, why do you think she drops this blue highlighted phrase into this sentence? Drop that in the chat. I want to see what a couple of you are thinking. That's right. So Monique is seeing she's emphasizing, like I talked about earlier. Connie Leindecker is saying disapproval. Ashley Rolfe, can we take Connie or allow Connie to come off of mute? And Connie, I'd like you to say more about that disapproval bit, if you would, please.
Great. All right. The disapproval is that she wishes that more people would, I'm going to go into commentary and say that they'd hold their culture better.
Yeah. I think you're onto something there. And I see Becky Henderson just dropped that down in here. Thank you, Connie, for coming off of mute and sharing that with us. Connie's got that. Becky has that down here too, with loss of culture. Laura has, it resonates with her unpacking the variables of identity, et cetera. Yeah. So we see now, and a lot of you who are familiar with this passage, right? I know a lot of you, your students may have just recently written on it, if you did mock exams and other things. You're seeing how this little modifier in this sentence relates to that situation, relates what she's trying to claim. So yeah, thank you all for dropping that in. And then she also talks about not just too many of us, but too many who have been educated here. And I like that, dropping that educated in, because she's saying too many of us, we're educated, we're smart. Why don't we speak the language of our heritage? Almost drawing a line to say, is it a problem that we're educated and don't speak the language of our heritage. Is that almost saying that we can't because we're educated? And I don't think Sotomayor is doing that. I think she's criticizing that comment. All right. And then she adds this, I happen to, and I really appreciate that happen to. It's very colloquial, very conversational of her. So I think you all are seeing all the different ways that these modifiers come in to change the very base sentences that are there. But what's really important about these basic sentences too, and we didn't have time for this, so I didn't go into this exercise, but if we're reading something much more difficult than this, teaching students to grab sentences that they don't understand or that have so much in them and simply find the base noun, verb, maybe a direct object, just depending. Find those things to find out what is happening in the sentence, the root, the foundation of the sentence, and then the modifiers. How does that matter? That's a technique that I use when I teach poetry. That's a technique that I use when I ask students to read something that is really long and dry. In Unit 4 of the language textbook, we use a government document that is really uninteresting, but it's very indicative of the types of text that students will engage when they see government documents and bureaucratic documents and things like that. But there's lots of sentences that are really long and drawn out that you find the base parts and then you see how the other things relate to those. That's the key. So here I give the process for this, find the base sentence, explore the modifiers, what questions are they answering? Or what does the writer want me to know by telling me this? How do those modifiers contribute to the message? All right, so I'm going to move on and look at another one here. And I'm going to ask you all to participate in the chat just a little bit with this. Go ahead and find the base sentence because there are two sentences here. Find the base sentences. You can put this and go ahead and type them in the chat. Yeah, my soul was nourished. Yep. They were my friends. Yep. You could say that there are two clauses in here. My Latina soul was nourished. I visited my grandmother's house. But I do agree that I'm saying as I visited is modifying when that soul was nourished. And we could get into conversations about adverbial phrases and stuff. We're not going to get into that because that's when people's eyes start to glaze over. Remember, we're teaching first semester freshman composition. Okay, good. So yeah, I see other people dropping those in. Yeah, we got that. So then we can start to explore the modifiers. So what are some of the questions? Go ahead, look at some of the modifiers here and drop in the chat. What's one of the questions that you see some of these modifiers answering? Yeah, when this happens, thank you. Yeah, where, when, yeah. So it's all that. Yeah, it's really that basic who, what, when, where, why, and how kind of stuff. Yeah, but it does get a little bit more deep with clarifying her identity. Beth Carlson, thank you. Nice comment. When was her soul nourished? Yeah. What was it that, or who helped her to nourish her soul, her cousins, and her extended family, et cetera. Yeah. So we see this. We see the things that she's wanting us to focus on. And we could ask, what does the writer want me to know by telling me these things? And then if we think about the text as a whole, which we don't have time to do here, but if we had read the whole text and talked about what the purpose might be or what she's trying to accomplish with the text as a whole, we would think, okay, how do these modifiers contribute to that? And that's going to help us transition to think about situational demands. So situational demands, we think about the rhetorical situation. And some of you all nailed that when we started thinking about sentences at the very beginning. And I appreciate that when we activated our thinking. I've listed the big ideas for AP English language here because a lot of times these get lost in the mix. Everybody's focusing on skills, that they're focusing on the essential knowledge. We forget that all of those things fall under these big ideas. And these are the things that kids should take away from the class and hopefully remember 10, 15, 20 years down the road. If they forget exactly what cause and effect organization is, they hopefully still remember that individuals write within a particular situation and so on. The things I really wanted to point out was the situation, as you all know, is the foundation for everything. Everything should come back to the rhetorical situation when you're reading, when you're writing. And in that situation, writers are making choices, students as writers, as well as the students reading the writers. And they're trying to recognize those choices and what those choices are in relation to the situation, the reasoning that relates to the situation, and the stylistic choices. Okay. All kind of review, things people know. So let's go ahead and look at this prompt. And this is a prompt from the AP Language AMSCO book. And I'll read it aloud. Social media has been celebrated as a way to easily connect with family, friends, and acquaintances around the world. Distances that could once only be bridged by mail or phone are now overcome with a few clicks of a button. There are those, however, who condemn social media's value, claiming social media perpetuate hate speech, promote the distribution of inaccurate information, influence individuals to develop negative self-images, and even destroy the foundations of grammar. Write an essay that argues your position on how social media influence the lives of individuals and the way they communicate. All right, so this, familiar with the course, this gives us the full situation, and we know students are going to develop their position on these things. With that, I have developed two thesis statements. One is a higher thesis statements, not I've developed. I've pulled two thesis statements, a higher performing thesis statement, and then what I kind of call a medium performing thesis. The high one, you see here on the top left, ironically, social media contribute directly to both an isolation and a tribalism that damage how individuals function in their communities and families. And then the medium one, social media hurts individuals by making them avoid actual interactions with actual people and focus only on things they agree with. I think you can probably see the clear distinction between these two, just based, I'm not saying about the whole essay, but just the thesis statements themselves. But we're going to focus on this one. And let's pretend that this is a sentence that occurs, or these are two sentences that occur in the body of the argument the student's writing. Social media leads to loneliness. This leads to isolation. These are sentences that I would completely expect students to write in their 40-minute rough draft writing. And they might be true in the larger context of the student's argument, the student's writing. We're just looking at these two sentences by themselves, but they're pretty basic. We've got a subject, social media. We've got a verb, leads. And what does it lead to? It leads to loneliness. Here we have this loneliness leads to isolation. Okay. But I've got a couple questions. Isn't social media supposed to connect people? How and why does it lead to loneliness? This is a pretty big claim, pretty big statement, but there's nothing else there. And it might be in a sentence before it or a sentence after it, but just looking at these sentences, I've got some questions. Is isolation really that bad? I mean, my wife is an introvert. She likes to kind of keep to herself, and she likes just to spend a day with a book and by herself or whatever. And so is isolation really all that bad? I mean, it seems to be treated as a bad thing here. I'm not on board yet. But people aren't really isolated though, are they? I mean, they're on social media, they're connecting to people. So I've got some questions here as the audience of this sentence, these sentences. Well, look at this sentence. This is the same base sentence. CBC, social media leads to loneliness. This leads to isolation. But I've answered these questions. Though meant to bring people together, social media, ironically, so I'm saying, isn't social media supposed to connect people? Well, yeah, it is meant to bring people together. That's why it's ironic that it leads to loneliness. How and why does it lead to loneliness? Because people interact less. So they're not interacting and they're still lonely. Now, there's more here. I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. See, this leads to a psychological isolation. So people aren't really isolated. It's just kind of a psychological. Oh, that's something interesting. Kind of got me going there. And isolation with unpredictable consequences. So is isolation really that bad? Well, maybe it's just unpredictable. We don't know. Oh, there's a lot more here for me to think about as a reader. And again, this might have happened in subsequent sentences, possibly. This is an exercise to get students thinking about how the things that they insert into sentences, the modifiers, help them to address particular things that the audience will need. I want to come back to this green section because this goes to this says, okay, how and why does it lead to loneliness? Because people interact less. And I say, but it's okay not to interact with everyone. What if I'm an introvert? And then what if I don't want to interact with the people around me? Say, well, as people interact less with those living around them, what if I don't want to interact with the people around me? Well, those are the people who know and care about them. And that could lead to oh, I see. Lots of your students probably already do these things when they write. They just don't think about it. So asking them to go back into their own writing, their own sentences. Maybe this sentence that the student initially wrote looked a lot like this one. That's on the screen right now. Having them go back and reverse this process and say, what questions are you answering and why does it matter? That's an exercise that is very well worth doing. We didn't have time to do it today. So now we'll look at the second thesis, and you guys are going to play around with it a little bit. So here's the second thesis. Social media hurts individuals by exposing them to things they normally would not experience and making them avoid actual interactions with actual people. Okay. This is the sentence that shows up in the student's paper. Social media shows people bad things. Go ahead and use the chat and drop in some specific questions that you might have about this basic sentence. And it's not that basic because we've got bad in there, right? It's modifying things, kind of like the barely earlier. Go ahead. What's a question or two you might have? What bad things? Thanks, Donna. What do you mean by bad? A lot of you all are grabbing onto that. I appreciate it. Doesn't real life have bad things in it? Yeah, thanks. Yeah, who decides what is bad? Y'all are on that one. I love it. Are new experiences bad? Yeah, that's good. How does it show these things? What things, again? Are some people particularly vulnerable? So like what people, what about these people? Is it all people here? All social media? Yeah. So you all are really wanting, and you probably notice that you ask these same types of questions when you're responding to student writing, because students are saying these things and you're wanting them to get more specific with it. Well, these are activities that will help them with that at the sentence level. All right. What does it show? What does it reflect? What are some highlights? Thank you, Michael. What kind of people end up in these bad situations? Right. Thank you. So I've got some questions here that I was asking, and they're going to reflect some of the things that you all asked too. So how does it show people bad things? What does it show? Who does it show? Sorry. What people? Why is it bad for them? And then here's a sentence here's the sentence after I've added in some answers to these things. By connecting people all over the world. So that's how it does it. Social media shows people like who? What people? Like children and those who have lived sheltered lives. Things they are not ready to see. Sorry for the typo. Because they cannot understand. You see, because they cannot understand, so they're not ready to see it. My next question is, why are they not ready to see it? Because they can't understand it yet. They're naive. They're kind of sheltered. All right. And so students are hopefully seeing how Yeah, they wrote a sentence that certainly might work in their paper. Social media shows people bad things. Okay. But I know I want more. I know the student has got more up here. They just need to get it in there. And so they can go back and look at these drafts and work with their own writing to expand these ideas. So that is a whirlwind through some of the why it is important to ask students to look at the base parts of sentences and then look at modifiers. One of my favorite EKs, yes, I have a favorite, this piece of essential knowledge, is the one about modifiers in the course and exam description. And it is specifically talking about the way modifiers change and the way modifiers change the way the audience understands things in a sentence. And it's just one little EK, but it's one of the most important ones, I believe. So some tools and tasks. You will get a copy of this PowerPoint presentation. Ashley's going to send it out to you when you get your email later on this week. So you don't have to copy all of these down or take screenshots if you don't want, but there's some really basic activities that I encourage you to do regularly, not just once or twice across the course of a year. Isolate sentences and explain the modifiers, similar to what we've just done. Okay, if you do that, start with short sentences and then work up to longer or even multi-sentence excerpts. Have students exploring the style. And so I often hear people talk about style as something kind of amorphous. I often hear people talk about the word flow, which just feels weird to me. But usually what they mean is the way that a text is connected and consistent. And usually what they're talking about, if you ask and really ask them to show you examples, they're talking about the way modifiers and sentences relate to one another across a text, because that's helping to connect the ideas. So there's all kinds of ways you can expand this to where maybe they start with a sentence and then expand it to looking at a whole paragraph and the different modifiers in the different modifiers across multiple sentences in the same paragraph. One of my favorite things when we're doing rhetorical analysis, and one of the things I think students get the most out of, not just sentence-wise, but analysis-wise, is to have them, I like to do it in groups, identify what they think is the most important sentence, not the claim, not the thesis, but the most important sentence, and then break it down and explain it based on its role in the text. Why is it so important? What are we learning about it? Okay, it's great. Then think about this as far as students writing. Sentence combining is an old school activity. I really encourage people to think about not just combining sentences for the sake of combining sentences, but asking them to constantly track the base sentences and the modifiers in relation to the claim. So that as I'm coming around, if they're doing it on a big poster, if I'm asking them to put it on a Google slide or whatever and put comments all around it, if they're doing it on a Jamboard, however I'm doing it, I should be able to come around and say, okay, this thing here between the commas, why is that there? How is that helping me as a reader or helping something in the situation to develop the purpose of the claim? All right, and they really start to get that idea. And then longest to shortest. You could also do shortest to longest, but I like them to maybe find a super long sentence in their paper and shrink it by revising it, removing modifiers or moving modifiers, maybe making more sentences. And when they really start to dig into those things, they see some common patterns, some common mistakes they make when they're writing, and it helps them to check it. But what's nice about that is those mistakes are then in the context of thoughts, not just grammatical errors or correctness errors. They understand that, oh, by misplacing my modifiers constantly, it's unclear what I'm talking about. By using vague pronouns, I don't know, my reader can't understand who I'm talking about or what I'm talking about. And I do that pretty regularly. Students will see those things on their own. As you do some of these possible activities, please remember, keep it low stakes. Use student writing or things they're currently reading. Work in pairs or groups. I really encourage that. It kind of takes the pressure off. And it also helps students to lean on one another and learn from one another. Always explain the modifier to the situation, whether they're reading or whether they're reviewing their own writing. How do these modifiers relate to the situation of the text or of the argument? And encourage deletion. Kids get really committed to things that they've written, that they've spent time committing to the paper. And you think about, if you're a fan of writing, creative writing, you may have heard Hemingway's whole thing about killing your darlings. You know, he was talking in particular about spending hours on one sentence and getting it perfect. I'm not asking for that. No one's asking for that with these students. But say, hey, you know, I know you've got that in there, but do you need it? You think it sounds good? It might sound good, but do you need what that is giving? Is it going to be helpful for the situation? And with that, I want to remind you that we want them to be risk takers and mistake makers. So push them to try those sorts of things. And the final thing I'm going to share with you here, and I give the copyright for this at the bottom. I came across this years ago. I keep a PDF of it on my computer. I give it to my students, everything else. I did buy the book. I have the book. But this is a combining clauses tool that has been one of the best tools to help students play around with sentence structure and order. And so I encourage you to check this out. The way I like to do it is give each option numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And I'll make assignments and say, hey, I want everybody to go into their paragraph, go into one of their paragraphs and find 2 sentences where they either have or you can revise to use options 6 and 7. And then we share those sentences. It's not just doing it to do it. It's then we share them and talk about why they did that and how changing something with a non-essential, with an essential dependent clause or non-essential dependent clause, how that changes the sentence for the sake of the entire paper. It's really, really effective. It helps students to see and begin to understand that sentences, to come back full circle, are not just grammar. The choices they make in a sentence relate directly to the idea they're trying to communicate. It's a complete thought. All right, so any FAQs or questions from you, you're welcome to drop those in the chat. I see a couple of you have already dropped in a couple things here. You know, Kelsey, I appreciate that. You've been trying it with your kids. Keep trying it, expanding on your ideas and connecting those. Keep trying it. The thing I encourage, if we're doing sentences in isolation, students may not be able to connect the choices they make to the larger purpose of an argument. Make certain that they're connecting it to something bigger. That's why I had the thesis first, and then we would look at the sentences so that we were constantly thinking about how this relates back to the thesis so that there's that connection, that consistency. So I'll give you my email address here in just a moment so you guys can be in touch with me. Susan, if you try it tomorrow, let me know how it goes. Drop me an email. Y'all, I do coaching on these types of things too. If anybody wants some help on putting these lessons together, things, you can reach out to me. It's what I do. And I can't stand, I can't stand grammatical instruction. It's just boring to me. But when I think about how we do these things in the confines of the situation and how it relates to thinking, it's much more interesting to me. So if you have any questions or anything, you're welcome to drop me a note. A reminder, not only do we want students to be risk takers and mistake makers, we are risk takers and mistake makers. So don't be afraid to try that lesson. As Kelly said, she's been trying these things with her students. Keep trying. That's the goal. Some self-promotion here. Check out the AMSCO books. A lot of these ideas are in them and throughout them. You can you'll get information from Ashley. You've registered for this. You'll get information from her. Also, I work with applied practice a little bit. We do mock exams across the country and you get feedback. You can reach out to me about that. And I also do some AP Summer Institutes. I'm doing those through Garden of English with Tim Freitas, who a lot of you know. And I also have some other workshops I'm doing this summer around the country, some online, some virtual. I'm sorry, some online, some in person. And here's my contact information. Please feel free to reach out, and I'll gladly stick around to answer a couple of questions if you've got them.
Brandon, did you get those two last questions?
I did, and I was getting ready. Yeah, thank you so much, Kristen. The text, the combining sentences comes from is right here. It's called The Writer's Workplace. It's huge. It's really meant as a remedial writing book for first semester, but we are working on a composition guide for the AP language book and the AP literature book. We have a book map and everything else made for them. And there's going to be resources like that in those as well. And we're hoping to have that a prototype by the summer and hopefully have the whole book done sometime next fall. So keep an eye out for that. If you're interested, keep checking on Perfection's website.
And was that the same book with the clauses?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Sure is. It's actually, Thompson Wadsworth should give it, but it's actually the inside cover. They think it's so important that it is the inside cover of the book. And it's fantastic. Susan, I think Ashley said she's going to try to share it tomorrow. If not tomorrow, it's usually by the end of the week.
Well, I wanted to thank Brandon on everyone's behalf for his time and his insights this evening. We appreciated it. As a reminder, and as Brandon just said, Ashley will be sending out an email to you tomorrow. It'll come from Perfection Learning, and it will have a recording of tonight's webinar and the slide deck that was used in it. If you do want to learn more from Brandon, please take the time to subscribe to the Next Step blog from Perfection Learning. That URL is nextstep.perfectionlearning.com, and there you will find recordings of past webinars that Brandon has done, blog posts, and lesson plans. And Ashley will also be putting into the chat a 1-question survey. If you would take the 1 minute it will take you to complete that.
Take the survey. Take the survey.
That helps us know what sort of topics you would like to see for future webinars that Brandon or other authors can offer for both the AP Lang class as well as AP Lit.
Yeah,
Thank
we
you,
are
everyone,
planning
for joining
these.
us.
We're planning these every month, a year out. So like let us know what you want. Let us know what you need, what your kids need. And we will do our best to, if I can't address it, we'll find somebody who can.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening, and have a great finish to your week.
Bye, everyone.